Hello out there, and thank you for joining me. My name is Bob with Thrive Wellness, and today's wellness presentation topic is processed foods and label reading basics, deciphering nutrition labels and ingredients lists to make better decisions about your food. So today's agenda, a few things we will touch on. So we will begin to answer the question, how processed is my food? Based on some cues we can take by looking at the packaging that a food item is in. That can give us some indication, level of processing and how healthy that food might be for us. We'll also touch on ingredients listings and kind of in a similar fashion, how we can look at the ingredients list and have a better feel for the level of processing and how healthy that food might be. Nutrition label basics, we'll kind of look at the 4 key areas on a nutrition label and again, how that information can help us make better decisions. We'll also look at some of the misleading packaging claims that we'll see on food packaging, which is really more of an extension of the advertising message and oftentimes not rooted in reality or fact when it comes to the true nutritional value of that item. And then we'll put it all together and hopefully begin to make better decisions with our food. So let's define, for the purposes of our conversation, what processed foods are. So processed foods defined. So the USDA defines a processed food as one that has undergone any changes to its natural state. This can include washing, cleaning, cutting, cooking, freezing, drying, canning, packaging, or any other procedures that alters food from its natural state. So processed foods may also contain many other added ingredients to enhance flavor, stabilize texture, and extend shelf life. So looking at that definition of processed foods, that can mean an awful lot of different things. And processed foods really kind of fall along a continuum. And we'll take a look at that continuum and exactly what that means for the health value of given foods. So this is the NOVA classification system for processed foods. So again, we mentioned kind of this continuum between unprocessed or minimally processed foods, then you have processed ingredients, and then processed foods, and then ultra-processed foods. So in a moment with the next slide, we'll break down each one of those categories and exactly what that means. There have been a lot of studies over the years, especially with the last few decades, that would indicate consuming too many foods from the ultra-processed foods group, and even certain selections from the processed foods categories really does contribute to chronic disease. So let's break down that NOVA classification for processed foods and really dig into each one of these categories. So first off, unprocessed foods is quite simply any fresh fruit or vegetable or other plant food that is truly in its natural state. You can think of an apple that you pluck off a tree. That is a totally unprocessed food. And then you have minimally processed. So these foods have been slightly altered for the purpose of preservation. This might be salad greens, for instance, that were chopped up and put in a bag, or vegetables that were frozen kind of at the peak of their freshness to make them more shelf stable. Again, a little mechanical processing or changing the temperature. But we're not altering the nutritional profile of that food, which is very important for that minimally processed category. The next category is processed culinary ingredients. So these are food ingredients that are used that go into another recipe, for instance. So they're derived through minimal processing, usually mechanical processing, such as grinding or milling or pressing. So some of the most common processed culinary ingredients are cooking oils and flours. You can also see herbs and spices in this category as well. So the next major category then is processed foods. So these are foods from either of the 2 previous groups that have added sugar, salt, or fat. Canned fruits and vegetables, for instance, are in this category. Freshly made bread would be in this category. Canned tuna are also common examples. Most foods in this group contain approximately 2 to 3 ingredients. So that takes us to the ultra processed foods category. Foods in this group are designed specifically for shelf stability and palatability as kind of the main goals of these foods. Not so much nutrition, but how do we create a food item that can sit on a shelf for long periods of time and provide a lot of flavor. So with this group, many ingredients are added to further preserve, stabilize, and flavor foods. So these are common things like sweets, breads, cereals, sugary drinks, crackers, chips, breakfast bars. You'll find a lot of the common junk foods, if you will, in this category. So from the standpoint of health and minimizing chronic disease risk, the bulk of our food really should come from those first few categories, especially the unprocessed and minimally processed categories. Processed culinary ingredients, and to a lesser extent, those processed foods. We can find some reasonably healthy options within that processed foods category. But when we get to the last category, the ultra processed foods, there's a lot of research that will indicate consuming too many of those foods can lead us down the path of chronic disease. So let's take a look at the standard American diet. So the standard American diet is the most prevalent food pattern in this country. So if we can recall from the last slide, the ultra processed foods, right, the ones that are processed the most. So in the standard American diet, that represents 62% of the calories that we eat in this country. Again, those highly refined and processed oils and sweets and refined grains make up the bulk of our consumption. And then you've got some animal products like meats, eggs, dairy, and fish. We tend not to select the better options, opting for more red meats and processed meats. And then the smallest two chunks on this pie, of course, are those unrefined or unprocessed fruits and vegetables and minimally processed grains. So the problem with this is when we process a food to the degree of an ultra processed food, we're stripping out all the nutrients that food item may have had in it, and we're adding in place all types of preservatives, shelf stabilizers, and items to make that food taste better. So we're talking about salt, other preservatives like sodium benzoate, sugar, and fat. And again, this accomplishes shelf stability and makes that item taste good, but it's not good for our health, as all these studies are now pointing out. When we consume ultra refined or ultra processed foods as kind of our go-to food, that definitely does lead us down the path towards chronic disease. And certainly all the studies coming out over the last couple decades, as well as the prevalence of things like heart disease, diabetes, and cancers in this country certainly do support that, unfortunately. So let's take a look at food ingredients lists and talk a bit about how we can look at those lists and they can give us an idea of the degree of processing that food item has undergone. So again, ingredients lists can help indicate the level of processing that a food item has undergone. Even from a very basic standpoint, the sheer number or amount of ingredients is a big hint in terms of the level of processing. So ingredients on a food list appear in order of their prevalence by weight. In general, the greater the amount of ingredients, the greater the degree of processing. So we'll talk about some of these items below here on the next slide. But if we're seeing a lot of things like added sugars, added fats, sodium, preservatives, binding agents, artificial flavorings and colorings, if you're seeing a lot of words you might find it difficult to pronounce, that in itself can be an indication to the degree of processing in that food. So let's talk through some tips to recognize highly processed foods, or that ultra processed foods category. So if you're looking at the back of that food item at the ingredients list and you're seeing a lot of ingredients listed that you would just not cook with at home or cannot identify exactly what that is, that's a good indication of a highly or ultra processed food. If you're seeing a lot of added sugars, either high up on that list or you're seeing multiple added sugars, that's an indication of a highly processed food. So anything ending in OSE or simply listed as a sugar. Other names can include things like dextrin, syrup, molasses, honey, fruit juice concentrates. There are literally over 50 different type of nutritive sweeteners on the market. If you're seeing one or more refined grains added to a food item, again, refining grains strips all of the nutrients out of that grain. So when you're looking at judging the health value of a processed food, you always want to look for the term whole grain in that ingredients list. Again, the refining of those grains strips out all the nutrients, all the fiber, and all you're left with is that very fast-acting carbohydrate. You're also looking for added sodium and added fats that could be in the mix. And then again, simply a whole list of ingredients that you probably might find difficult to pronounce. Again, these are preservatives, these are binding agents, these are stabilizers that aren't particularly healthy for us. Another rule of thumb, if there are greater than, say, 5 to 6 ingredients, probably a pretty highly processed food. All right, so now we'll talk about food label basics and how to utilize the information you'll find on the typical food label to hopefully make better decisions about the food you choose. So first off, we'll look at the 4 key categories of information you'll find on a typical food label. So first off is going to be information about serving sizes and servings per container. You'll see that at the top. Calories will be listed directly below. And then nutrients will take up the biggest section there in the middle. And finally, percent daily value. And we'll cover each one of these 4 categories in a little bit more detail as we go along. So next we'll talk about serving information. So this is going to provide how many servings are in a container. So with the label we're looking at on the right, that's going to be 8 total servings. Serving information is also going to provide the serving size. So this is how much food counts as 1 serving. So with this particular item, it's 2/3 of a cup. So nutritional values on nutrition labels are based on 1 serving. So keep in mind, many packages may contain multiple servings. So it's necessary to multiply the number of servings by how many calories are in that container to get the total calories in a container. So I think we've all probably been in that situation where we saw an item maybe had 230 calories. We thought it was 230 calories in the whole container, but it turns out within that container there may have been 2 or 3 servings. So we ate way more calories than we had realized at the time. So that concludes part 1. So in part 2, we will pick up with the discussion regarding the calories section of the nutrition label.